JNU academic count. Yeah, then academic hotspot.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're just about to start. Please come.
Conference sudah masuk ni. Conference itu.
Bisa saja nak respon. Ya. Hallo. Brauchst du nicht aufzustehen? Alles gut?
Ja.
Hi.
Yes, friends and comrades, please settle down. We're going to start in another 2 minutes flat. Please. Please be seated. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 12th Global Labour University Conference, which is being held, as you can see, at the JNU. My name is Archana Prasad, and I'm the convener of the GLU India program at JNU. I'd like to welcome all the friends from the GLU fraternity, as well as those who are associated with the group but not really part of the steering committee or the alumni. I hope that we at JNU can provide a good atmosphere and a happy environment for the conference here. As you can see, the main theme of the conference is Reincarnation or Death of Neoliberalism, the Rise of Market Authoritarianism and its Challenges for Labor. I think that this theme is very relevant for us today because workers' movements all over the world are facing great repression. And in this country itself, it's not only workers' movements that are facing repression, but peasants and workers are rising up by the hordes to express their dissatisfaction with market-oriented policies. We are also standing in a campus where students and teachers are struggling to save and protect the democratic ethos of this university. As you know, JNU as a premier institution is known for its progressive and democratic ethos, and by holding the conference here in such a politically difficult situation, we are very happy to express our solidarity with the struggles of the workers, peasants, students and teachers, not only in this country but in the world over. When this conference was first conceived, the situation in both this campus and the country was very different. Subsequently, with the help of the GLU International Steering Committee, we could organize this conference, and we received an immense amount of support, encouragement and help from various actors in the GLU International Committee. Some of them are here on the dais. We have Professor Santosh Mehrotra, the chairperson of the Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies, which is hosting this conference. As you know, ours is a very small and new center, and it's a great privilege for us to be hosting a big international event like this. And I must say that the students and the teachers have tried to put their best step forward to hold this conference. In fact, you will see that many of our students, we are a small center of about 100 students, are here working round the clock with smiling faces. So I hope that you will have a good stay at JNU, and if there are any hitches or problems, you will contact the coordinators and also forgive us if we are not able to resolve them there and then. We also have Professor Christoph Scherrer from ICDD. He's been one of the strong pillars for the organizing of this conference, and as you know, ICDD has played a major organizational role in supporting us. Then we have Michelle Williams, the interim chairperson of the GLU steering committee. Like the countries in transition, GLU is also in transition over here, and Michelle is here to talk about the GLU. And we have Mirko Herberg from the FES, who has been very generous with us. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for cooperating, being on time, and being such good guests from the first day onwards. I'd also like to thank all the staff and the volunteers who have helped to structure and do this program. Without much ado, I'd like to call upon Professor Santosh Mehrotra from the Center for Informal Sector and Labour Studies to welcome you forward.
Thanks very much indeed, Archana, and I want to add my own words of welcome to all of you. How many international participants? Hands up. Gosh, that's huge. And how many of you have been to India before? Hands up. Oh my God, oh dear. That's very impressive. So in some ways, you're very much familiar with this country and this city. So I really want to warmly welcome you on behalf of our center in Jawaharlal Nehru University again. And thank you very much for taking the trouble to come all this way. I want to sort of make just a few remarks to get this conference going by speaking about the main theme, which is reincarnation or the death of neoliberalism. I felt the question mark at the end of it seemed to suggest a degree of optimism that neoliberalism may be moving towards its death. But you and I all know that capitalism has an enormous capability and ability to actually reinvent itself all the time. So I would sort of, if I was asked to vote between which way is neoliberalism moving towards its dying phases or reincarnation, I would argue that it's sort of is likely to reincarnate itself, just as it has been doing. In fact, a defining characteristic of capitalism since the 19th century has been its evolving nature and its ability to reinvent itself. Let's recall that neoliberalism arose in the late 70s, early 90s, when the golden age of capitalism and the golden age of growth after the Second World War was collapsing after the two oil shocks. But while the oil shocks and the neoliberal aftermath, led by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, led to 2 decades of lost growth, 1980s and 1990s, in both Latin America as well as in Asia, OECD countries recovered. In fact, if anything, they experienced a third industrial revolution. A whole 100 years after the second industrial revolution, they experienced the digital revolution, which led to massive increases in capital productivity. It went on to sort of manifest itself in the growth of global value chains into emerging market economies. A few decades later, of course, we are already into another technological change, which is automation, robotics, artificial intelligence. In other words, in summary, a fourth industrial revolution, which is likely to raise the productivity of capital even further. And of course, the trend that was set in motion of the falling share of wages in total value added across the globe with the beginning of neoliberalism is probably going to get intensified. So I would say that the real question that we have to sort of put to ourselves, as those of us who think of workers first before we think of the capitalists, we should ask ourselves, is the share of workers in developing countries in particular who have access to social security, who have access to social insurance, just as the countries in the OECD have, all of them have access to social security. Is the share in emerging market economies and developing countries of those who have social security, is that growing or not? And the evidence on that is not very positive. Because after all, if neoliberalism and if capitalism is going to keep reinventing itself, then we have to make sure that all of us who think about workers first are able to fight to ensure that all workers, but all workers in emerging market economies have social security. Let me sort of just say a few more words about how things have moved since the global economic crisis of 2008, because which one could say was a crisis of neoliberalism, with the financialization of the real economy really run riot. So what was the immediate response of US and of OECD governments to that global financial and then the economic crisis? The response was big bailouts and increased regulation of the financial system, which of course we have to recognize prevented a Great Depression from happening. It didn't prevent a recession, but it certainly prevented a 1939 type Great Depression from happening. But the question I think we have to ask ourselves in this conference is, all the regulations that have been put in place post 2008 by the OECD countries, are they likely to prevent another global financial or economic crisis? This is a question for this seminar. Because there are a multitude of areas where, despite the increases in regulation, there are at least a dozen of areas of regulation which are remaining outside the remit of regulators in OECD countries. Another area of concern lies actually outside of formal banking, which is that because because of QE, because of quantitative easing, because banks are offering much lower returns, firms and investors have moved their money into money markets. Now, money market funds are offering higher deposit rates than ordinary banks, but they're often without the insurance that comes with bank deposits. So here is another source of vulnerability. A third source of vulnerability is that, while banks are subjected to tougher rules than non-banks, people have moved funds to non-banks in OECD countries, and they are doing that in our parts of the world as well. A fourth source of vulnerability comes from just the fact of the ultra-low interest rates in OECD countries that currently exist, which has been pumping excess liquidity into emerging market economies and possibly creating greater source of vulnerability into the future. So suppose that interest rates in OECD countries remain low, although they might be tending to sort of rise now, but suppose they remain low, and when the next global financial crisis hits, will central banks have the tools in place to actually, in their armory, to actually address the problem with quantitative easing? Because they wouldn't, if interest rates are at 1.5% and haven't moved back to the erstwhile rates of something like 3%, this tool in their armory would simply not be there. And finally, we have, of course, a new phenomenon in the global scene, a new source of vulnerability, which is Trump. Because Trump has called for a re-examination of all the regulatory reforms of the financial instruments and then the financial system that had been put in place. So if under Trump regulations are rolled back that were put in place post-2008, we might be into yet another financial crisis. So while one has great confidence, and the capitalists certainly have great confidence in their own ability to reinvent capitalism, we as those who think about workers first need to consider whether our workers are prepared for the next crisis. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Santosh. Now I'd ask Michelle to come and talk about this.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. I want to do something similar. I just want to ask, how many of you are GLU alumni in this room? And I'm sure, just by looking at you, you represent all the continents, or almost all. How many of you either teach or participate in GLU activities? And then how many of you have never heard of GLU before this conference? Thank you as well. Okay, so welcome to everyone from these different categories. I'm, as Archana has mentioned, I'm the interim chair of the International GLU Steering Committee. I'm also the chairperson of the South African GLU Steering Committee. And what many of you, even our alumni, would not know is that GLU, I'm the interim chair because GLU lost one of its 3 daddies this year in terms of its official position. Frank Hofer, we're lucky at almost all our conferences. We've had the 3 original daddies, I call them the daddies of GLU, which is Frank Hofer, Hansjorg, Herr, and Christoph Scherrer. And we've seen them retire, move on, stay. And in South Africa, we have a 4th daddy. I mean, each program actually has a daddy. Our daddy is Eddie Webster. Every program will have its daddy. I think it's actually quite an interesting trajectory, too, that you'll see that some of us now are women in GLU. And I think that's a contribution, or an achievement that GLU has also made. But I took over the steering committee, the international, because Frank left the ILO. And for the first time, we actually realized, oh my God, we have this unbelievable network, and somehow we've held together for, this is our 12th conference, but I think GLU started about 14 years ago, Christoph? 14 years ago in Germany. And this program, this network has grown in order of magnitudes. In my interim steering committee, steering chairperson role, we did this little group brochure, which will be available on the website. And it's extraordinary the things that this network have achieved. I mean, from our MOOCs, which are one of the most recent ones, but over 10,000 participants, and there will be a little presentation on the MOOCs, to our publications, to over 400 alumni, to short courses, certificates. It's extraordinary, and each campus is just doing an amazing contribution to labor, to scholarship, to trying to keep a labor-focused left scholarship alive, and I think that's an incredibly important achievement, and also to make universities open and accessible to unionists. Certainly in South Africa, that is not always been our history, and it's been a hugely important accomplishment. And I think that we should congratulate ourselves for this achievement and thanking our daddies for thinking of this achievement, or thinking of this goal. Okay, so I also wanted to just say that I find GLU to be an extraordinarily special network for three things that it achieves, beyond all the specific things. And sorry, we just finished this, so we don't have printed versions. We had just a couple printed before I left South Africa, but they'll be available on the website. And this lists what we've done, but for the specialness of the network, for me, it's for three reasons. One, it's one of the few networks in the world, I think, that really, in a very genuine and sustained way, brings together trade unionists, labor activists, worker activists, and scholars, labor scholars, in genuine long-term relationships. It's also extraordinarily plural in its ideological orientation. We have Marxists in every variant of Marxism. We have Keynesians, we have social democrats. We even have our own yogi Marxists, and those of you who've been in GLU for a long time know who I'm talking about. As well as the third thing I think is so extraordinary about GLU is that it is a network that crosses the global north and global south, and again, in a genuine way, not in just a global north coming to the south and trying to tell us what to do, but we're actually genuine partners. We have three sites in the global south, India, South Africa, and Brazil, and two in the global north, Germany and the US. And those relationships, I think, have been quite extraordinary. All of our campuses, we all work together. There's extraordinary exchanges, but also our alumni work together and share a lot of ideas. I think that what this has done is creates a really special space. And as we just heard, the world today is has few of these spaces right now. We are in a country that is, I hope I don't get you guys in trouble, but it's verging on fascism. We have, I think probably in most of our countries, I was just talking to a few alumni saying, oh, how's it going? And every single one of the voices were talking about how horrible it is in their country right now. South Africa, we have Zuma, who's just in state capture. You can hear from my accent, I'm originally from the US. We have Trump. We have, I think in every single country, really scary stuff. And that makes something like GLU and the ability to maintain GLU that much more extraordinary. And I think it's something we must protect. And going forward, even without Frank, we will have to figure out how we're going to organize ourselves without our central force. I also just want to say that Archana mentioned this is our 12th conference. And that, for any network, especially a network as kind of complicated and unusual as ours, to maintain is extraordinary. And not only have we been able to maintain these conferences, as I mentioned, we've grown in order of magnitudes, both from the campuses to our associates to our alumni, and just in the interest of our network and the type of scholarship that people in this network do. One of the things I think is really exciting is that our alumni are doing amazing publications. They're writing. So they've actually brought into their union work. Over 85% of our alumni stay in labor-related activities in their unions. But they're also contributing in new and exciting ways by publishing their ideas and helping us think through from the workers' perspective. I also just want to thank, as the international representing all of our campuses, I want to thank Archana and Mehrotra. We organized this last year in South Africa, and all I can say is hell. And they've done an extraordinary job. I know there's a whole team behind them. These are the ones that we got the emails from, so I'm mentioning them, as well as the Institute and JNU itself. I also want to just thank our alumni and my committee members, international committee members, because I think it's all of us that have actually been able to keep this thing together. So thank you very much, welcome. And I shouldn't forget to also thank Mirko, who has been one of our crucial funders for many, many years. Thank you.
Now let me call one of the big daddies of the GLU network, Christoph Scherrer, to speak up.
Well, I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces, and I'm curious about those who I don't know yet, and I hope we have a chance to get to know each other over the next couple of days. But first of all, I would like to extend some thanks, and the thanks starts, of course, with our host, and I believe the host has done a tremendous job it's not so easy to import international people to India. You have to go through 3 ministries. And they did a fabulous job to do that. And I can imagine how much time that diverted actually from real stuff, what one wants to do as an academic. And then they did a wonderful job in securing this nice venue and also many, many places where we can stay. So some of those places I heard were not quite as nice as some of you expected, but it is not so easy with a tight budget to find wonderful places nearby one of the most famous universities on earth, JNU, and here in this place. So you would have to stay far outside of Delhi to have a nicer place for the same amount of money. For those of you who stay on with us for the Alumni Applied Research School, I think the next venue will probably compensate you for some of the troubles you might have now. I also want to thank all these volunteers that Archana was able to mobilize in your department, and they were extremely nice already, helping me with the phone and many other things. And I think we should extend them a big hand there. Then, of course, we have here these wonderful logos, and there is the ILO, and the ILO, again, mobilized money. I think it is not necessarily the ILO, it was more Frank Hoffer mobilizing money from the ILO, which helped a lot. And the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation has been mentioned, always a wonderful support for our activities. And then there's this other logo, that's the ICDD, and I stand here for this International Center for Development and Decent Work. And we have also a wonderful staff in Kassel that organized for not all of you, but many of you, the flights and so on, and also supported financially then this event. And for this group, where Birgit Fellmeden is sitting there in the middle, and she is the head of the staff that supports this wonderful thing from Kassel. Talking about the ICDD, you might want to know what its relation to the Global Labor University. Well, on the basis of the Global Labor University network, we were able to build this center to get money from the German government and so it is quite logical that we support the Global Labor University there. Our main business is the support of graduate students, PhD students in the network that are sitting at our network partners, for example, at WITS or Unicampi, and of course also in Kassel. But we also support the Alumni Applied Research Schools, the faculty exchange that strengthens the network, and some master scholarships. So I think that is what we can do through the money we get from the German government. But we hope that we also can do more than just mobilizing money. I hope we can also stimulate some interesting debates and bring in our own expertise. And I want to end with a few ideas I have on the conference topic. The return of authoritarian capitalism. Shortly after the financial crisis, which started in the heart of capitalism in 2007, I wrote a little piece in one of our outlets, publication outlets, managed by Nicholas, who is sitting over there, the Global Labor column. I hope everyone has already a subscription and gets it into the mailbox. It's almost weekly there. And in that piece I wrote that though capitalism lost, and especially financial capitalism lost its legitimacy through the crisis, it does not mean that the those who have predicted that, who have critiqued financial capitalism, would be in the driver's seat. What could also happen, and what happened in the past before, that such a major turmoil of capitalist accumulation would rather lead also to the rise of authoritarianism on the one hand among the elites, and also supported by the elites, but exclusionary policies. And I'm not saying right-wing policies, because I don't like right-wing and left-wing, because one never really knows what does it stand for. For me, this kind of policy is an exclusionary policy, meaning that one tries to better yourself by excluding others. And it is not just xenophobia, because in Germany, we know that, unfortunately, 1 million or more Jews were killed, and those Jews in Poland were killed, so overall 6 million Jews were killed. But important for the point I wanted to make was that these German Jews were Germans, and you couldn't really differentiate them. They were not foreigners, they had been there for generations, and nevertheless they could be sorted out. And I think that is a process that happens also in other places, where it is not just those who came just 3, 4, 5 decades ago. No, it is those who have been there, because the exclusionary policies don't need foreigners. They find people, minorities, whatever, they find them to exclude in order to better their own. But what is driving that is, and that I find very important for us to remember, what is driving them, I believe, is that these people don't really believe that it is possible to challenge the elites. Because they cannot fight against the elites and get from the top 1%, as it's so wonderfully played out in the United States with the 99%, they are not able to get something from the 1%, so they rather say, well, then we'll try to kick out the vulnerables we take from them. That's the easier road. That's the easier road. And what does that mean for us going for a different kind of vision of society, an inclusive vision, and a democratic? Because in a society that is unequal as we have it, is never a democracy. It doesn't work as a democracy. A democracy is only there then once we have achieved a certain level of equality. And on that level, we can talk to each other and build societies. Otherwise, we can call it polyarchy or whatever, but it's not a democracy. So if we really want to go for democracy, then first of all, we have to spell out that vision. But on the way to that vision, we also have to show victories. We have to show that it is possible, through collective action, to get concessions, to win something, to show those people who are not necessarily evil. People who are voting for exclusionary politicians are not necessarily evil, but they seem to be convinced that they cannot better their life by challenging the elites. They can only better their life by pushing out certain minorities, people who somehow don't really belong to whatever they believe belongs to the nation or the locality. So to win over these people, it is not enough to have wonderful visions. I think we also have to show them that through collective action, they can better their life, and a collective action not against the vulnerable, but collective action against capitalism. And I hope that we can expand on this topic throughout the conference and find ways in that direction. Thanks for listening.
And now I invite Mirko Herberg to say a few words.
Dear colleagues, dear brothers and sisters, we have heard talk about the founding fathers of the GLU. I would consider the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, belonging to that illustrious group. And I myself may not be a founding father, but I may be considered a son of the GLU. And being a good son, I have heard of what my fathers or my elders have said. And I would just like to add a few thoughts to what has already been mentioned. Now, FES, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, is a social democratic political foundation based in Germany, but active all over the world. And well, if you have followed the news about recent developments in Germany, you may not expect a representative of German social democracy being jubilant here. But are we depressed? No, think twice. We know that we have some serious business to do. Let's get started. Reincarnation or death of neoliberalism, the rise of market authoritarianism directs us at, we have not overcome neoliberalism yet, but we are already faced in many countries across the globe with its ugly descendant, a populist authoritarian attempt to take control by often placing identity politics to cover up the unabated advance of capitalist expansion. It is important for this conference to take place in Asia, where we on the one hand celebrate diversity, the movement of people and long traditions of pluralism, but where at the same time we witness in a number of countries tightened political control, the closing of democratic space, the revival of authoritarianism, all with devastating consequences for working people. In this context of global upheaval, where more people and political leaders think in terms of division and walls, of separation rather than integration and cooperation, initiatives like the Global University, Labor University, are more important than ever. The GLU is, for us in FES, one, a place for studies for the analysis of the deeper roots and structural reasons of how economies, labor markets, and societies evolve. Second, it is a place for joint research, for joint projects and action. GLU is a truly internationalist project, one that contributes to a labor movement that is truly global, in that while its actions is rooted locally, connects struggles transnationally. Third, the GLU is a place for innovation. We are all witness, you are participants in new learning and study methods. Online tools have been developed, the MOOCs have already been mentioned. We further new conceptual approaches such as the concept of power resources. What we do is to link theory and practice in many of our projects. So for all of these reasons, FES is proud to be an active part of the GLU project. And this GLU project is more necessary than ever, as we cannot ignore the fact that the counter-project to neoliberal globalization is currently not dominated by progressive forces worldwide. We observe how the poison of neoliberalism, with its focus on individualism, competition, adaptation to markets that are not regulated, has destroyed so much substance in social relations, has destroyed so much trust and confidence in the public sphere. And when a sense of community, of solidarity is being destroyed, when public services are curtailed, when work is insecure and does not earn a decent living, people feel that they are left on their own. And it's for them only natural to have a reaction to that. And these times we observe that people look to the right to find solutions. However, these supposed solutions only reproduce the exclusion, this time based on identity, sometimes on nationalism or ethnicity or religion. In my country, in Germany, we experience that relative material well-being is no guarantee for decency, for solidarity, and for respect. Real or perceived injustices, deprivation, neglect, insecurity leads to a closing of minds, to the reproduction of prejudices, to a rejection of all that is different, simply spoken, to a return to the primordial thinking. 10 days ago, at the German federal elections, of the 6 million trade union members, close to 1 million, that is 15%, voted for right-wing populists and extremists. This is more than the average population, actually. And this happened not in a time of economic crisis, but in times of a robust economy with unemployment at an all-time low. Yet, precarious work is substantially higher than a few years ago. So our analysis show that not only precarity, not only lower education is the reason for a shift to the right, it is also a question of identity, culture, and the sense of belonging to a community. And this analysis makes things more difficult for trade unions and progressive parties. It is insufficient to blame neoliberalism. It is insufficient to think of material issues only. Yes, socioeconomic development are big factors for feeling secure or insecure, but it isn't enough. It has to be embedded in a narrative, in a story, and a reality of social progress, a perceived reality of a sense of belonging, of feeling secure of where people are. As a consequence, trade unions' tasks are to fight for economic and social security and for people to have a say in shaping their workplace, their sectors, and their communities. To my mind, however, it is important that we stop the lamentation in which we sometimes get caught up. It is time that we turn to the question of power, of our power. Let us look how the labor movement can strengthen and apply its power resources, become a trusted and successful champions of workers of all trades and orientations, and by it, create bonds of solidarity. This is the essence of a recent FES project that we call Trade Unions in Transformation, a project that focuses on successful labor struggles. We have compiled 26 stories of trade union successes, real successes and successes in the making, that show it is possible for labor to win, even today. It is my hope that in this and in following GLU conference, we get to hear more examples of trade unions winning. And I hope that we in GLU focus our work even more on playing a contributing role for trade unions winning, and that we involve our network of current students, alumni, engaged students in projects of strategic action of trade unions. Let us, without ignoring what happens around us, talk about our power and overcome neoliberalism and its ugly descendants. Thank you very much. We can only do it together.
Thank you everybody for your words of encouragement. Now we will wind up the session and we'll move towards the keynote address by Professor Prabhat Patnaik. The address will be chaired by Professor Hansjorg Herr. So I invite Professor Hansjorg Herr and Professor Prabhat Patnaik on the dais.
The topic of this conference, reincarnation or death of neoliberalism, very important topic, and it implies that we are standing at a crossroad, that different ways are possible, different types of economic models, different types of neoliberalism probably, and I think this is the topic of the first keynote here, and actually what was mentioned before today, when we look what happened after the 70s, 1980s, we found a type of neoliberalism which we could call corporate neoliberalism. It was very much centered around multinationals. It was very much centered about concentration of wealth. And indeed, this type of neoliberalism came in a crisis with a great recession. And it's open in which direction neoliberalism or economies develop. And I think this is the question here. And I'm very happy that we have as a keynote speaker Prabhat Patnaik from JNU. And I think there's nobody better suited for this topic. Let me very shortly, I looked up what he did. Let me very quickly tell. So he studied in Oxford and taught in Cambridge. And he became already in 1983 professor here at the JNU. And he's still teaching. And he's a specialist in macroeconomics and political economy. He has written many books about inflation, growth, accumulation, but also visions of socialism. And so he's very well suitable for this keynote. He has many, many other functions. I just want to mention he worked for the United Nations, he worked together with Joseph Stiglitz, and so on. So I'm looking forward to listen to your keynote. It is planned that he will speak around 40 minutes, so we have 20 minutes for questions and comments. So please.
Chairman, members of the conference, I'm extremely grateful for the honor of being asked to provide the keynote address to this conference. It's not a subject. I'm going to talk about neoliberalism and the growth of the fascist tendency. It's not a subject on which I have any great expertise, but it's a subject which actually concerns me greatly, like it concerns everybody else. I'm sure there are many people here who have greater expertise on this than I have, but because all of us are so concerned with this subject, I thought it would be appropriate if I at least flagged off some issues on this topic. The fact that all over the world there is at this moment an extreme right-wing upsurge in the sphere of the polity is undeniable. Whether we think of the United States under Trump, among whose limited readings, by the way, is Hitler's Mein Kampf, whether we talk about Britain, where the UKIP at one point appeared to be making great progress, whether we talk about France, where Marine Le Pen came second in the presidential elections first round, whether we talk of Germany, where the AfD has recently done remarkably well, whether we talk of other countries like Norway or Austria or Hungary or Poland, and likewise, above all, when we talk about India, where for the first time you actually have a Hindutva government in power, all over the world there is undeniably an upsurge of extreme right-wing politics. I describe that upsurge as the growth of a fascist tendency. I do so advisedly because the term fascism would not be used by many, and of course I do not for a moment wish to suggest that we are going to have a replication of the kind of experience that the world had seen in the 1930s. Every new period is sui generis, but nonetheless there are certain similarities, nonetheless there are certain kind of parallels which one can draw attention to. I use the term fascism in preference to two other ways in which this tendency is often described. One is that it is populist. Now, of course, there's an element of populism in it, but I believe the term populism or populist does not do justice to the phenomenon that we observe, because populism is sometimes used dismissively as a term even to describe welfare state measures, all of which all of us would value. For instance, many people would refer in India to the MGNREGS as a populist measure. So using the term populist as a blanket term to cover both welfare state measures as well as what's going on, even though one may preface the term populist by right-wing populist, seems to me both to underestimate the phenomenon that we are observing globally, and furthermore to actually damage the term populism to an even greater extent than it has been damaged. The other term that is sometimes used to describe this phenomenon is extreme nationalism. Now, I think again, the term nationalism is something which is not a homogeneous category. Hitler's nationalism was very different from Mahatma Gandhi's nationalism. Anti-colonial nationalism was very different from aggrandizing imperialist nationalism. Therefore, just to use the term nationalism as a blanket category is misleading. And what is more, when you actually look at these movements, they are not really talking about the nation. Whether you look at Trump, whether you look at Modi, you do not find any attempt, for instance, at a reconstruction of a national economy, for instance, by insulating it from global financial flows. As a matter of fact, what you have is a solicitousness towards the interests of international finance capital, which is completely inimical to any concept of nationalism. And what is more, even domestically, what you do observe is supremacism of various kinds. You have white supremacism in the United States and elsewhere. In fact, one of the leaders of the AfD in Germany said, I go down German streets and I don't find a single German. Now, what he meant by that is that I don't find a single white person, because how do you see a person and say whether he's German or not in a multiracial, multicultural society unless you're identifying nationality of a person entirely with skin color or such like things. So obviously what we see is supremacism, whether it is Hindu supremacism, white supremacism, rather than nationalism. And I believe supremacism is one of the characteristics of course, fascism, which is why I use the term fascism rather than either populism or nationalism. From what I have said, obviously there are certain kinds of characteristics because of which, despite the differences in time, differences in conjuncture, I use this term, and I believe these are characteristics which, in a sense, are essential features of a fascist tendency. A fascist tendency, needless to say, has to be distinguished from a fascist state, but on the other hand, as a tendency, there are certain very obvious characteristics, one of which I have already mentioned, that is the supremacism, the fact that it actually not only emphasizes identities, but it necessarily categorizes identities into superior and inferior. In other words, there is necessarily an element of supremacism involved in fascism. The other thing which is extremely common to all kinds of fascism is, of course, a recourse to unreason. Naturally, supremacism, which necessarily says one group of people, depending upon their skin color or depending on their religions, are superior to another, is one which in any case is based on an abdication of reason. The celebration of unreason is an essential feature of fascism. In fact, a major historian of German history, in fact, attributed the rise of Hitler to power in the 1930s by saying that it expressed a resentment against a disenchanted, secular world, and this resentment found deliverance in the ecstatic escape of unreason. This is Fritz Stern, who was a professor at Columbia University, New York. Now, unreason, therefore, whether then or now, continues to be an essential feature of fascism. The third important feature of fascism is, of course, that it is a movement as well. It's not, it's not just a right-wing phenomenon, it's a movement as well. In fact, one can talk in terms of it's being a mass movement, that it actually mobilizes large numbers of people. Latin American countries have been dotted with murderous gangs who go around killing revolutionaries, who go around killing Democrats, who go around killing intellectuals, but that per se does not necessarily represent a movement, while fascism does represent a mass movement. And you find in many of these countries, the emerging political tendency is backed up by movements of various kinds, if not to start with, at least later on. I mean, in the course of the growth of the fascist tendency. And the last and crucial part of it, which interests me as an economist, is the fact that all fascist movements at one point or another, in fact, get the support of the big corporate financial elite. Without that support, they really do not go very far. You have always had the Ku Klux Klan in the US, you have always had fringe Hindutva groups in India, you have always had fringe right-wing fascist groups in almost every country. But they become a significant phenomenon, of course in a certain conjuncture, which I'll come to in a moment, but they become a significant phenomenon only on the basis of substantial support from important elements of the corporate financial oligarchy or the corporate financial elite. Let me now come to the conjuncture. Now, I think the crucial conjuncture in which fascism emerges is, of course, one which is, in my view, characterized not only by neoliberalism, but by the crisis of neoliberalism. Let me just describe certain features of what neoliberalism has actually given to the world, even in its heyday, before I come to the question of the crisis. That essentially, there is a basic difference between neoliberal capitalism, or capitalism in the period of neoliberalism, and capitalism that existed earlier. We often think in terms of the current globalization being no different from, being essentially a carryover of the globalization that existed earlier, or the globalization that Marx and Engels had written in the Communist Manifesto. I believe that is not true. There is a fundamental difference between the contemporary globalization and all previous globalizations, in the sense that the contemporary globalization is characterized by a significant mobility of capital across the globe in order to set up enterprises in low-wage countries for meeting the global market. Had that been the case, then of course, had that been the case with earlier globalizations, then the distinction we have between the North and the South, between the advanced and the underdeveloped countries, is a distinction that would not have existed. This distinction arose precisely because labor from the South was not free to move to the North. Capital from the North was not, even though juridically free to move to the South, did not really intend to move to the South. It moved to the South only in areas like plantations, like trade, like minerals, and so on, which really were complements to the international division of labor that arose in the colonial period. But you did not have capital, let's say from Manchester, moving to Bombay in order to set up on the basis of low wages in Bombay, themselves a result of the process of deindustrialization which had taken place through the import of colonial textiles, to move to Bombay to locate plants on the basis of low wages for meeting the international market. If that was the case, or meeting the metropolitan demand, if that was the case, then the industry would have shifted from Manchester to Bombay, and of course the distinctions that we have between developed and underdeveloped countries, between the kinds of product mixes produced in underdeveloped countries vis-a-vis the kinds of product mixes produced in developed countries, all these distinctions would in fact have disappeared. They did not, because typically the world was segmented so that labor from the south was not free to move to the north. Tropical migration took place only within the tropics. Temperate migration took place in the temperate regions, European immigration to the New World, but on the other hand, tropical labor was never freely allowed to move to the temperate regions. It still is not. And as far as capital is concerned, capital, though of course free to move anywhere, really confined itself to moving into only those segments which really sustained the international division of labor of the colonial times, but it did not genuinely move in order to take advantage of low wages, to set up plants in the third world or in the south for meeting global, especially metropolitan demand. The fact that this was the case earlier can be contrasted with the fact that now you actually have an authentic mobility of capital, because of which you actually find metropolitan capital moving into third world countries to take advantage of cheap labor in order to produce for the global market, in order to produce for metropolitan demand. Now this, therefore, is a basic difference from what had existed earlier. This globalization, therefore, has a number of very important implications. The first implication is that it actually exposes the workers in the north to the baneful consequences of the huge labor reserves of the south. The labor reserves of the south used to keep the wages in the south at a near subsistence level, but on the other hand, the wages in the north could increase along with productivity because of the fact that the world was segmented. But if the segmentation of the world is somewhat overcome, in that case, you now find that labor in the north has to be exposed to the baneful consequences of the labor reserves of the south. Now, this is not to say that wages in the north have now come down to third world or southern levels, but certainly wages in the north are not increasing in keeping with productivity increases. What you actually find, Stiglitz, for instance, has found that if you compare the average real wages of a male industrial worker in the United States today with the real wages that obtained in 1968. He's actually comparing 68 with 2011. He finds that the real wage rate in 2011 was marginally lower in absolute terms. Now you may say that while therefore northern wages have been kept down because of the pressure of the southern labor reserves, the fact that there has been this migration of capital should mean that southern labor reserves should be getting exhausted, and therefore southern wages should also be rising. But you find that a second feature of globalization has been what Marx had called a process of primitive accumulation of capital. Neoliberalism, which is the economic policy accompaniment of globalization, neoliberalism has meant a withdrawal of the state, not a general withdrawal of the state as is suggested, state versus the market and we leave things to the market. No. It's a withdrawal of the state from specific commitments, from specific areas, from specific engagements in order to make the state much more engaged, much more solicitous with the interests or of the interests of the corporate financial oligarchy. So what you find is a change in the orientation of the state, not a disengagement of the state in general. Now, one implication of this change in orientation of the state has been that the state no longer supports the enormous sphere of petty production and peasant agriculture that it had begun doing in the period after decolonization. all over the third world, after independence from colonialism, the newly independent states played the role of sustaining and supporting and protecting peasant agriculture, of sustaining and protecting petty production in general. To be sure, not everybody was an equal beneficiary of this kind of state support. The richer peasants did better than the poorer peasants, but nonetheless, agriculture as a whole, which incidentally was seeing a capitalist tendency from within it through landlord and peasant capitalism, was nonetheless insulated against world market price fluctuations, was nonetheless provided with support of various kinds, including remunerative prices that the state in India, for instance, provided the agricultural sector, and including provision of subsidized inputs, credit, and such like, because of which there was a kind of viability of petty production which had been ensured. Neoliberalism, because of the changed orientation of the state, destroys that viability. As a result, you find a worsening in the condition of petty producers, of peasant agriculturists, and so on, many of whom either linger on in a reduced state in their existing places of work, or alternatively migrate to the cities in search of jobs which are non-existent and swell the reserve army of labor. But swelling the reserve army of labor does not just take the form, as one normally imagines, that there is a clear distinction between the active army and the reserve army, that let's say there's 10% unemployment, then 90 people are employed and 10 people are unemployed, but rather employment rationing increasingly takes the form of large numbers of people being employed only for 90% of the time and being unemployed for 10% of the time. So that employment rationing changes along with the change that is taking place in terms of swelling the size of the reserve army of labor, because of which what you have is a proliferation of casual employment, part-time employment, intermittent employment, disguised unemployment, and all kinds of things, which therefore have which therefore entail that the reserve army, growing reserve army, manifests itself in a new form altogether. Now all this has very important implications for the trade union movement, not only in the north but in the south as well. The trade union movement suffers a big setback, and along with this, the setback of the trade union movement, the left politics itself suffers a big setback for a variety of reasons. One of which, as I have just said, is the swelling in the relative size of the reserve army of labor, together with a change in the form of employment rationing. The other is, of course, the rampant privatization that takes place under neoliberalism. As a matter of fact, what you find is that all over the world, in the public sector, the workers are better organized than in the private sector. In the United States, for instance, you find that in the public sector, if you include education, roughly 1/3 of the employees are unionized, while the corresponding ratio as per the private sector is concerned is just about 7%. Likewise, in India, some of the most powerful trade union struggles were in the public sector. Some of the most powerful trade unions were in the public sector. And you find that, as a matter of fact, privatization has the effect of weakening the trade union movement for this reason. The third, which is a very obvious reason, is that in a world in which capital is globalized but labor remains stuck within particular countries, any militancy on the part of labor in any country basically means that capital goes somewhere else. And that being the case, trade union militancy has the effect of driving capital away, and which itself, because it affects the workers' interests adversely, because employment does not increase, itself is something which the trade unionists are chary about, and this of course naturally weakens the bargaining strength of the trade unions. Along with all this, there is also another factor which is of great importance, namely that I think all over the world because of neoliberalism, and in this period of neoliberalism, when you find capital is globalized and the only way of ensuring development in your own national economy is to see that capital does not flow out of it, and if anything, it is attracted into this economy, there is a hegemonization of the left in general and of the trade union movement also by neoliberalism. Now let me try and explain that, that this hegemonization occurs for a number of reasons. One, which I have just suggested, namely that you have to make sure that capital does not flow out of your country. You have to make sure that unemployment is not generated. There is no specific crisis inside your national boundaries because of the fact that capital goes out if there is too much of militancy. But I think there are also ideological roots of this hegemonization. One of which is, we notice in our country, is apotheosizing something called development. In quotes, development is a good thing. Someone is pro-development, someone is anti-development. The word development is in fact used again as a blanket term. It's supposed to be a very good thing. If land is to be taken away from the peasants for development, then that is supposed to be in the national good. And if the peasantry is opposing it, it's only because they're backward and, they're prisoners of an old ideology and so on and so forth. This apotheosizing of development, unfortunately, is something which also fits in with a notion that certain strands of Marxism have, namely development of the productive forces is always unambiguously a very good thing. That historical materialism teaches us that if you have development of the productive forces going on, that's a good thing. In fact, capitalism, its historic tenure comes to an end only when development of productive forces is no longer possible. This interpretation of Marxism, which I call productionism, is something which is one of the conducive factors for the hegemonization of the left by the neoliberal ideology. For all these reasons, you find that there is a general weakening as far as trade unions are concerned, as far as trade union militancy is concerned, and also as far as left politics generally is concerned. Blairism is something which actually begins to acquire a degree of prominence and hegemony in this period, because many people think that if we are Blairites, then we would be able to have development in our society, we would be conducive destinations as far as footloose multinational capital is concerned, which being mobile can actually come in and usher in a higher rate of growth. Now, I think the weakening of the left and the weakening of the trade union movement are very important factors constituting a backdrop to the development of fascism. Walter Benjamin had actually written about fascism in the 1930s, that fascism comes on the back of a failed revolution. Well, here we may not be talking about a failed revolution, but it is only a weakening of the left, a weakening particularly of the trade union movement that is actually conducive to the development of fascism. But there's another factor, as I said, it's not just neoliberalism, but in fact it's crisis which contributes to the development of fascism. And this crisis itself is not very difficult to understand. I said that because of the mobility of capital, there is a tendency for real wages, even in advanced capitalist countries, not to increase, while at the same time, in underdeveloped countries, even to those to which capital comes to locate plants, you really find no increase in real wages, because the process of primitive accumulation directed against petty producers also implies that labor reserves keep getting replenished, and therefore the real wage rate continues to remain at a broadly subsistence level, except where the government steps in, like in China, to raise the real wage rate. But the point is that therefore all over the world you find that the vector of real wages does not increase in this entire period, even as the vector of labor productivity increases everywhere. Now, if you have labor productivity rising and real wages remaining constant, then you find that there is an increase in the proportion of economic surplus in world output, and such an increase in the proportion of economic surplus gives rise to what economists would call an ex-ante tendency towards overproduction. Obviously, it means a distribution from wages to surplus earners, from wage earners to surplus earners, and at the margin, a unit of money transferred from wage earners to the surplus earners implies a reduction in the aggregate consumption, because the propensity to consume out of wage incomes is higher than the propensity to consume out of surplus incomes. So other things remaining the same, you actually find a tendency towards an overproduction. Historically, capitalism overcame tendencies towards overproduction in two ways. In the pre-First World War period, it overcame the tendency towards overproduction through encroaching on colonial markets, through ensuring that actually, in periods of crisis at any rate, you could encroach on the colonial markets and get out of the crisis, and once you have got out of the crisis, accumulation gets stimulated, in which case, of course, the encroachment on the colonial markets reduces in intensity, but nonetheless, that encroachment is what got the system going in the first place. By the First World War, the colonial markets have more or less got exhausted. In my view, the Great Depression, among other things, was a result of that. In the post-Second World War period, you had an alternative way of overcoming any ex-ante tendency towards overproduction, and that was through state intervention in demand management, which had been advocated by Keynes much earlier in 1936, but which actually began to be implemented with the emergence of social democracy to positions of power in the post-Second World War period, in Britain, in France, in Germany, and elsewhere. Now, as a result, you had capitalism experiencing in the period after the Second World War a prolonged boom, which many people have referred to as the golden age of capitalism. Now today what you have is, of course, colonial markets really cannot play the same role that they had done earlier, and what is more, state intervention in demand management is something which is impossible, which is made impossible by at least two factors. The first, of course, is systematic opposition of finance to any such state activism. Finance does not mind state activism. When President Obama pledged $13 trillion to bail out the American financial system, nobody said that, look, budgets have to be balanced or that fiscal irresponsibility is being engaged in. But on the other hand, if President Obama had actually enlarged the fiscal deficit, or if any government enlarges the fiscal deficit in order to stimulate a recovery, there would be massive opposition to it. What is more, this opposition would also make itself felt in real terms because finance is globally mobile. If finance does not like a government which is embarking on an expansionary program by stimulating a fiscal deficit, it will just leave the country. Many of you may have seen that in India itself, the moment the government started talking about giving a fiscal stimulus because of all this criticism that the economy was slowing down, you found that the rupee fell by 50 paise for the first time after months and months. So the point is that any such thing gives a hint to finance, which therefore leaves the country because of its opposition to fiscal deficits by the state. So, in order to stimulate employment. So today capitalism is actually in a situation where there is a crisis of overproduction. This crisis of overproduction can no longer be met through the traditional weapons by which in different periods of time capitalism has met such crises. The only offsetting factor against such a crisis is, of course, an asset bubble based boom, that if you have an asset price bubble building up, then of course some demand may revive and some activity in the economy may revive. But asset price bubbles, which actually sustained the boom in the 1990s, because of the dot-com bubble, which sustained the boom in the first part of this century because of the housing bubble, have both collapsed, and you find that no new boom is on the horizon stimulated by an asset price bubble. And even if such a boom did come about, and despite the interest rates being virtually zero, you find no asset price bubble taking place, and consequently capitalism continues to remain mired in a crisis and would continue to do so. In a situation like this, where you find that the political position of the left has weakened all over the world, where you find that trade unions are actually in a much weaker position than they were, let us say, in the 60s and 70s. Therefore, the political capacity of the left to intervene has got greatly reduced. Movements such as supremacist movements of various kinds, which always enjoyed a certain patronage in petty bourgeois white-collar circles, can suddenly take off. And when they do take off, they even, in the absence of an authentic left challenge, they even can take away certain significant proportion of working class support. We were given the figure in Germany that 1 out of 6 million workers actually voted for the extreme right party. And this is something which you would find elsewhere in a position where the left does not come with an alternative agenda. In fact, these are periods which are particularly conducive to the triumph of unreason, because you find that suddenly there's a desire for a messiah. People who are facing the additional burden of a crisis on top of the fact that their real wages have not increased in the past, therefore feel helpless, and there is a desire for a messiah. There's a desire for a man with a 56-inch chest and all the rest of it. So the desire for a superman, a desire for a charismatic figure who can actually lead them out of this quagmire in which they find themselves, gathers momentum, particularly in periods of crisis when they have come on the basis, in turn, of a stagnation in the level of real wages. So you find these are periods which are conducive to the development of the fascist tendency. But to say this does not, of course, mean that a triumph of the fascist tendency is inevitable. On the contrary, there is one particular weakness about contemporary fascism compared to 1930s, which we should be clear about. This weakness consists in the fact that in the 1930s, actually in Japan, in Germany, the depression was overcome through larger military spending. Japan, by the way, was the first country to come out of the depression because under Finance Minister Takahashi, it actually, expanded the economy in order to generate military spending, in order to find, stimulated by military spending. And likewise, exactly, the Nazis brought about in Germany a boom, an upswing through larger military spending. Now, in today's world, fascism is singularly incapable even of enlarging the level of activity. Why? I mean, there is talk about Trump expanding the military budget, but it's singularly incapable for a very obvious reason. That if government expenditure is financed by taxing the workers, then it does not generate any additional demand. A worker given, let's say, $1 of wages, will be consuming the $1 of wages. If that dollar is taken away and spent on military expenditures, then of course the composition of expenditure has changed, but there is no increase as far as the level of demand is concerned. The level of demand would increase only if government expenditure is financed either through a fiscal deficit or through a tax on capitalists, because they are the ones whose taxation would impinge mainly on savings and therefore would generate a larger demand. But neither of these is really feasible, particularly because of the power of finance today, and also because of the fact that finance is globalized while the states continue to be nation states. There is no talk even of having a coordinated fiscal stimulus by a group of nation states coming together today. There was talk of it in the 1930s, but it got shot down. In fact, a group of German trade unions had made this proposal first. It got shot down. But today there is not even a talk of it. As a result, we are now in a situation where not only would the world economy remain mired in a crisis, but at the same time, even the contemporary fascism would be incapable of getting any economy where it happens to come to power out of that crisis. Now, this is a situation which actually provides an opportunity to the left, to trade unionists, to working class politics to play a role, if it can come forward with an alternative agenda. And incidentally, where it has broken away from Blairism, where it has actually come forward in an energetic way with an alternative agenda, fighting against the hegemony of finance, it has actually checkmated the fascist threat. Many of you may have seen that today against President Macron, the main opposition does not come from Marine Le Pen. The main opposition comes from Monsieur Mélenchon, who is the leader of the left, together with the French trade unions, which continue to remain strong because France continues to have a fairly strong public sector. So you have, you may have seen that Marine Le Pen has actually lost 10%, at least 10% of the votes that she got even in the first round of the French presidential elections, and is now reduced to about 8 seats in the French parliament. And what is more, if you add up the votes of the French Communist Party and Mélenchon, they marginally exceed the votes that Marine Le Pen's party has got, the National Front has got. UK, which had got 11% votes in the previous British parliamentary elections, is now down to 2%. Why? Because of the fact that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn has actually taken away the UK vote. So wherever you find a regrouping of the left shedding itself of its Blairite legacy, the left actually taking on international finance capital. As a matter of fact, there was substantial support that was building up in the US, for instance, for the left-wing candidate, but on the other hand, he withdrew. Had he not withdrawn, it's quite possible that he might even have defeated Trump. So the point is that wherever the left actually manages to regroup itself, manages to shake off the ideological hegemony of globalized finance, wherever the trade unions are once more organized to carry out struggles, difficult no doubt, you find that the fascist threat can actually be checkmated or even reversed. Now this is something which has very important lessons for us, and of course is very important that in meeting the fascist threat, we do not just say that neoliberalism is what is going to continue. I believe it's a fallacy to believe that liberal politics grows out of neoliberal economics. On the contrary, for reasons I've been discussing, in fact, the denouement of neoliberal economics is a destruction of liberal politics. Therefore, to preserve liberal politics, it becomes essential to go beyond neoliberal economics, and that can be done through an alternative agenda of bringing direct benefits to the people. In India, for instance, I would say such an alternative agenda must take the form of having a set of economic rights, universal, justiciable economic rights, right to free health of a sort which is provided by the National Health Service, right to free and quality education, right to old age pension, right to food, right to employment. You can actually have a progressive agenda before the people, which, unlike the fascist parties which are currently acquiring hegemony or currently on the upswing, they cannot provide anything specific, they cannot even promise anything specific other than fighting the other. So in such a situation, I believe that the possibility of defeating fascism is something which must not ever be underrated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive introduction to the debate about neoliberalism and options. we have a little bit time for questions or comments. So please, who would like to ask a question or a comment? Christoph? Is it okay? We collect three. Yes. Christoph, and then you, and you. Okay. Christoph? The microphone.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, so thank you very much for a very concise description of the current situation. I really was impressed by your definition of fascism. I think that is very to the point, that it has this irrationality, what we nowadays call this post-factism there. That is very clear. And it has the supremacy aspect there, this an exclusion of others. Where I differ from you is on one point concerning the possibilities for capital accumulation. The one way that had been done, and in a way you mentioned the road to it, but you didn't really mention what then happened, is it is not just the military build-up, but it is the war. And the war destroying then what has been accumulated before, so that one can start again. So, and that I think is an important point, because we should not close our eyes to this possibility there. And I'm also not quite so sure whether the left just has to recoup itself in such ways. They're like Corbyn. Yes, I think one should do that. But the challenges remain in a way to really show certain successes. So we would have to see if Corbyn or others, once they are larger in their movement, once they're in government, whether they can really do something in government there. What are the restrictions of the modern capitalist state in the modern world, as you described, for really changing course?
Thank you. Please. Yeah.
Hi, I have a couple of political questions. I will try to be as brief as possible. The first question was that, unlike you, the Politburo of the CPM has hesitated to call the Modi government fascist. They use the word authoritarian. I just wanted to, what do you think is the reason for them to hesitate from using the word, and do you think that their thinking was misguided? The second question was about, you were talking about Blairism and how Blairism needs to be jettisoned, and I disagree with you on the fact that, on the point that UKIP's vote share has gone down because all their votes have gone to Labour. In fact, I believe that these votes have gone down largely because the Conservative Party has more or less adopted the UKIP platform and just made it a little more palatable. And the votes also, the UKIP votes also, as exit polls showed, split two ways. My question was that in a situation where the traditional left parties have taken this neoliberal turn, whether it's the Labour Party, whether it's the SDP in Germany, whether it's the New Deal Democrats, or even the NDP in Canada, and when you have a situation where trade unions have been weakened through the informalization of society, where you have a situation where a left-wing government coming into power like Syriza did in Greece finds it hand-tied by the international troika, and they ended up adopting the very same reforms that the referendum rejected. In such a scenario, at what level do you think workers should organize? On a plant level, on a sector level, on a national level, international level? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There one question in the back. No, there was one in the back. And please introduce you shortly.
I have a question. The question is about currently in the international academia, we have seen that there has been a promotion, or so to say, a lot of research has been conducted on inequality. Now we have transited from addressing the issue of poverty, and we are hitting hard on inequality. This has happened after the publish of this Piketty's book, Capital in 21st Century. Anyways, my question is that, which problem should be addressed at first? Is it poverty or inequality? And speaking about, if we talk about the universal program that many people, many countries are trying to introduce and implement, don't you think that such a program is actually ignoring the question of inequality that is more vital, rather than only addressing poverty? Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to answer?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that some of these questions have been raised, because since I had to curtail my speech to about 40 minutes, I missed out some of the things, and it gave me a chance to expand on these. Okay, the first question is about military build-up alone is not enough, but as a matter of fact, war, because it destroys equipment and so on. The destruction of the war actually tends to have an effect in kind of, economic revival. The fact that destruction in a war has an effect on economic revival is not in doubt. But at the same time, the fact remains that in Japan, you had actually overcome unemployment before you went to the war. In Germany, you had actually overcome unemployment before you actually, well, okay, in Germany, the war itself started much earlier, but certainly before the attack on Poland. So the point is that, and in the United States, you had, in the post-Second World War period, pretty close to full employment, 4% unemployment in the Kennedy years, pretty close to full employment even before the Vietnam War had heated up. So in a certain sense, war is an accompaniment, you see, war is an accompaniment of military build-up. It's never the case that you have a military build-up and you remain quiet. Obviously, any military build-up tends to create an atmosphere where wars do occur. But let me take capitalism at its best, at its relative best, namely that there's no war, there is military expenditure which can bring the economy close to full employment, as some people are saying Trump is going to do. In fact, in America, there's a view in the left that this is what Trump might attempt. But even such military expenditure, unless it is financed either by a fiscal deficit or by a tax on profits, is unlikely to actually stimulate or revive the economy. And I say that's the point I was trying to make. Then the other question which you raised, which also was raised elsewhere, namely that, you see, as long as you have individual nation states confronting globalized capital, and you remain within the vortex of globalized capital, no matter who comes to power, you'll have the same program. You'll have the same program because that is the program globalized capital likes. So if you are going to have any different agenda, in that case, you have to de-link yourself to a certain degree, to the requisite degree, from the phenomenon of globalization. You see, if you have globalized capital, then there are only two ways of confronting it. Either you have a global state, and the global state is captured by an international working class movement, or alternatively, even if you have in particular countries a state of workers and peasants that happens to come up, or a state mainly sustained by the support of workers and peasants that happens to come up, it can confront only by delinking from globalization. There are no two other ways. And since there is no international working class movement worth the name, there is no international peasant movement, there is no prospect of an international coordinated struggle of workers and peasants against the hegemony of globalized capital, What you can hope at best is that in particular countries, you can actually have progressive governments sustained by the support of workers and peasants coming to power, and such governments, if they are not going to go the Syriza way, have got to de-link themselves from the process of globalization to the requisite degree. I'm not saying that, autarky, but to the requisite degree. Now this is, by the way, something which is not recognized on the left, and I believe this is one of the reasons for the paralysis of the left. Because it is said that globalization, even capitalist globalization, represents an advance, represents a step forward. Any delinking from that represents a step backwards and should be avoided. But I believe that in the current conjuncture, no left-wing agenda is possible unless there is a degree of delinking. All right, the second question about the CPIM. Well, I don't know what the CPIM thinks. I can hardly answer for that. But the point is that, that there is a view, starting from the 7th Congress of the Communist International, that if you characterize something as fascist, then against it you have to have a united front of all parties, including liberal democratic parties. And I think there's a lot of reservations on having a united front with Congress, which would follow if you call BJP a fascist party, because the Congress happens to be itself committed to more or less a neoliberal agenda. That could be the reason why many parties of the left in India are reluctant to call the BJP fascist. Now, I don't see why these should be tied. In other words, calling the BJP fascism today is not the same, as I said, as fascism in the 1930s. There are specific features of a fascist movement, of a fascist government. I would certainly not call India today a fascist state, of course I would not. But on the other hand, there are fascists in state power who are trying to push it towards a fascist state, and our objective should be to prevent that. And to do that, one can actually get together with other political formations which are similarly inclined, but do so on a programmatic basis. In other words, you don't have to just get together without a program, but get together on the basis of a program where, of course, further carrying out of neoliberal reforms, within which, by the way, currently the kind of top item in the list would be labor market flexibility, are in fact prevented. All right, now where did the UKIP vote go? I don't know, but the point is that there is no doubt that Labour share of the votes went up, UKIP share of the votes went down from 11 to 2%, 9% drop in UKIP share of votes. Where exactly these votes went, I don't know, but there was a significant increase in Labour votes. And also, let us not forget that in the Brexit, a substantial part of substantial number of British workers voted for Brexit, and many of them would have voted for Jeremy Corbyn in the parliamentary elections. So that I think some of the UKIP vote, I would say not just some, a chunk of the UKIP vote must have come towards the Labour Party. I've already answered the question about left-wing government. Okay, inequality or poverty, which one should we accept first? Let me make one thing clear. I believe both inequality and poverty are generated by capitalism. Okay, I believe the proposition that actually capitalism overcomes poverty is a proposition which I don't accept, because while it is true that in metropolitan countries poverty was alleviated, the same capitalism, if you see it as a system incorporating both the metropolis and the colonies, really produced poverty in the colonies, absolute poverty. In fact, as you know, the magnitude of food grains, annual per capita availability of food grains at the beginning of the 20th century in India was 200 kilograms. By the time of independence, it had come down to 138 kilograms. Then it went up under the dirigist regime, the Nehruvian regime, and under neoliberalism it has come down again. It's about 162 kilograms today. Therefore, of course, people in India don't live today exactly the way they lived at the beginning of the 20th century. Life expectancy is greater. They have access to antibiotics. They have access to modern medicine. They have access to electricity, which they didn't have those days. But on the other hand, if you take an elemental criterion, namely simply the availability of food, then you actually find that it is worse today than it was in the beginning of the 20th century. So capitalism overcomes neither poverty nor inequality. Therefore, my point is that no matter where you begin, sooner or later you are going to confront capitalism. After Piketty, I know that even the Economic Forum in Davos is talking about overcoming inequality. Let them do so. I believe the fact that in the post-Second World War period, there was a concerted attack on economic inequalities was because that was a period in which capital was in the retreat, in which working class movements everywhere were in the ascendancy, sometimes led by social democrats, sometimes led by communists and so on, and there was an overall looming socialist threat, because of which capitalism actually tolerated the kind of legislations which were brought in order to alleviate economic inequality in a lot of these countries. And that is true even in India, where in the post-independence period, the dirigist regime actually managed to keep economic inequalities down, but on the other hand, now with neoliberal capitalism, they are back to increasing.
Thank you. There are many more who wanted to ask questions, but time is over. So I think this was a very nice opening for this conference and for the debate for the next 2 days. So thank you very much. And I close this session, and please tell whether there's a break or whether it continues. Maybe you tell us. We directly continue with the next session. So, thank you.
May I request you to please settle down? We had a fantastic beginning in terms of the keynote address by Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and now we have a session on regional perspectives on new market authoritarianism and its challenges for labor. Mark, Crispen, where are you? Saket, can you locate Crispen? He was here. Bilge, Pinar, and Louis. We don't have Kjell Jakobsen. Apparently his flight got late and he will join us later. So once we have Crispen, then we can start this session, right? Yeah? And in which order would you like to go? Mark, do you want to start, or Louis, would you? Louis, okay? Yeah? And okay, all right. No, but what about, where is our friend Crispen? You know, I was talking to him in the earlier session.
बीच में कट कर रहे हैं ना एक दो बार नहीं हाँ बीच में जैसे कोई स्पीच खत्म होती है ना कट मार दिया
तो
जल्दी
मार दिया करो कोई बात नहीं कौन सुन रहा है
Louis, how much time? 10 minutes, Mark? 10, 15? Yeah. Louis, how much? 10 minutes? Okay, all right. Okay. So, you need PowerPoint or you Mark, how about you? You need PowerPoint, okay. All right. Okay. So, 10 minutes? Okay. And you have right? Okay. So, then I suggest that the first two are Louis and Crispen without presentations, and then Okay, so Louis, floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you, Praveen. It's a pleasure and honor to stay here. Of course, I'm not Kjell Jacobsen. Unfortunately, Kjell, who is a great representative of the trade union movement in South America and Brazil, he's flying up. I think at this moment he's flying from Doha to India, but I will try to give a short, brief presentation about the situation in Latin America, particularly in South America, because many of you probably know that Latin America was the land of hope for progressive forces for more than one decade. Between 2000 and 2015, many South American countries had progressive governments which tried to implement progressive policies, center-left policies. Of course, we had differences between at least two groups of countries in South America. The leftist group, the leftist bloc, which include Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and the more center-left bloc, which include Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, even Chile. But they all share a common view. They all made a strong alliance in order to confront the neoliberal paradigm. They confront neoliberal agenda, particularly in 2004 when they blocked the initiative for the free trade of the Americas in Argentina, but with a common agenda which was led by President Lula from Brazil, President Kirchner from Argentina, and President Chavez from Venezuela. But I have bad news for you guys. This time is over. Progressive governments in Latin America and South America are not the rule, and I think that the perspective for Latin American workers and Latin American trade unions are not really good. Okay, our region is facing a counter movement quite strong. Center-right or directly right-wing governments are running most of our countries, particularly Brazil and Argentina. In Brazil through a coup against President Dilma, in Argentina through democratic elections. But the problem is that if Brazil has a flu in the region, well, the rest of the countries are facing serious troubles. And if the flu in Brazil is followed by a flu in Argentina, well, I think that there's not much hope for the rest of the countries. Furthermore, Venezuelan situation is more difficult. I think that the situation in Venezuela is close to a tragedy, because they tried to develop a left agenda, and they tried to build some kind of socialism for the 21st century. And well, they are still fighting, but the situation is really worse than a few years ago. So we really don't know how it will end and how it will be the situation for Venezuelan workers, for Venezuelan people in 1 or 2 years from now. Other countries, small countries, which are still run by center-left governments, are shifting to some moderate positions, particularly Uruguay and Ecuador, who are still run by center-left parties, but they are not that center-left. They are more center. They shift to the center. And even Bolivia, which is probably the most advanced experience in the region,
are facing also the difficulties for sustaining this model of eco-socialism. I'm looking at Devan because maybe Bolivia is one try to discuss and to put together these two things, but they are also facing some difficulties because of these changes in the region. But well, after this short panorama of the countries in South America, I think that there are at least 2 or 3 questions that we should put on the table. The first 2 are: how could we end it here? Thank you. How could that happen? Why we shifted from the center-left policies to the right policies in South America in 2 or 3 years? And what we should learn from these experiences. And the third question is, which are the perspectives and challenges for labor and for workers in the following years. I think that I would like to stress some points that will be useful for the debates and will be useful for the learning experience that we should take. The first one is that even though our region experienced an increase in the recognition of workers' rights, an increasing in wages or unemployment, but there was no structural change in the economies of Latin American countries during this period of center-left policies. Particularly, this lack of structural change turned to be a major obstacle when the commodity cycle of high prices reached an end between 2011 and 2012. Our countries, most of our countries depended so much on exports of commodity issues, agricultural or mineral, and when these prices went down, all these countries faced difficult troubles in the macroeconomic policies. The second point that I would like to highlight is that there have been increasing tensions between the political structures and the civil society. One could say between the state and the social movements. But that was a problem that the center-left forces could not resolve successfully during those years. And the third point that I would like to highlight is that we probably subestimated the existence of internal and external forces that were waiting for the first signals of weaknesses of these political processes. So the United States, the media, have always been there, but they was waiting for these particular moments of weaknesses, and I think that we subestimated the power of these internal and external political adversaries. And well, going to the challenges and perspectives. As an Argentinian, Argentinians love Antonio Gramsci. So I would go back to Gramsci because he said one of his famous quotes, the optimism of the will, the pessimism of the intellectual. And I think that, okay, we have to be intellectually pessimist on the situation of Latin America, but we have to be optimistic from a trade union and from a labor perspective, because we are still fighting. But anyway, Latin America is under a huge attack from the neoliberal forces. But I think that we should stress that it's not only an attack against Latin American forces, it's an attack on labor forces all around the world.
Particularly one of the things that we are discussing nowadays in Brazil, in Argentina, but in many countries, is labor reforms, which try to reach two main objectives. The first one is to reduce the cost of labor force, and the second one is to weaken the trade unions. And Brazil has just passed a law to the parliament, which reach these objectives. In Argentina, we are discussing different kind of labor reforms in the same sense. But as you probably will know, in France, the President Macron has just passed a similar labor reform. And if we go to Spain, in 2012, the government has also approved a labor law, which is quite similar to the French law and to the Brazilian and to the Argentinian legislation. So I think that we need to see this process as a global process and not only the process that affects some particular countries. Another thing that I would like to share with you is that probably one of the main challenges for the future is how to rebuild political power and trade union power in a context in which we need to develop defensive strategies, because at the same time that we are defending ourselves as workers, as trade unionists, we also need to rebuild this political power and this trade union power. So I think this is probably the main challenge. And there is a threat that we are also facing in Latin America. It's not in the title of the conference, but we listened. We just listened some inputs. And I think we will discussing this thing of nationalism and fascism through these days, because this is a concern that we should take into account, the rise of nationalism or fascism or supremacism. We can discuss how to name it, but the problem is there, and it's a huge problem, including in Latin American countries. And in order to share some alternatives or to share some ideas to start thinking about, I think I will start with one idea, that it's a new idea, but it's an old one. I think that we need to talk again and seriously, once again, about internationalism and global responses to these threats and to these challenges from the workers' perspective. It's not a new discussion among workers. We have been discussing internationalism from more than one and a half century, but I think that we need again to discuss which will be our response, no matter which country we are representing in this table. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you. Thanks for flagging these concerns from a Latin American perspective. Crispen, on African perspective, shall we have your views? 7 to 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present or give you a perspective from the African experience, trying to get used to thanks for the organizers of the conference, the Global Labor University, and all the networks. I will try to sort of like draw on the African experience, mainly drawing on the experience from Sub-Saharan Africa, where I sort of, in a way, I'm much more familiar with. In this period, we have seen what I would call, in some cases, what may be viewed as a growing unity when it comes to the capital. but at the same time, it's also characterized by growing fragmentation when it comes to labor. There's more and more sort of fragmentation when it comes to labor as a collective voice, and this has this sort of like the overall effect of this is sort of we see a decline in as far as the political leverage, the political influence that our trade union movement normally has. Because of this growing fragmentation, we see labor becoming weaker and less sort of like power as a political force in terms of influence policies becoming more and more weaker. And at the same time, there's also, in some cases, there's also a contestation between the different forms of capital. In some cases, what you see, capital that is sort of European and American, sort of, that is sort of like in a way has been traditional, post the colonial sort of African. So we sort of at the same time, versus a new sort of forms of capital, especially the one that maybe Chinese and some indigenous sort of local capital. And at the same time, one characteristic sort of we're seeing a rise in terms of the super rich and the growing inequality in our society, which is tied to, because this is tied to a decline in real wages when it comes to what the workers get at the end of the term. Whereas we see there's a growing sort of very minority in terms of the super rich growing. At the same time, this is characterized by the decline in real wages in our society. More and more in many of our societies, more and more for people are being pushed to sort of unemployed, and at the same time, a growing dependence on social security. In many societies, we see that there are more people who are dependent on, there are more people who are dependent on social security than people who are actually the labor force in many of our society. And also, we see that they sort of like a rise in terms of what sort of maybe seen as a retrogressive competition between the different nations in terms of trying to attract the few capital that has sort of become very nationalistic. And this sort of results in the race to the bottom in many of the countries where you see that a lot of these transnational capital sort of has got sort of what may be seen as disruptive power, where we see that many of these multinational companies, they have got more in terms of power and leverage, more than some of our countries, for example, where in some cases some of these multinational companies, they have got power to change, to have influence. Just one multinational company, the labor relations in many of our countries, they have got the power, leverage to sort of like in a way to influence the state to change the labor relations, just to attract a single multinational company, which sort of in a way we have seen sort of the result of this new form of capitalism, where we see the growing sort of jobless growth, with this growing rise in terms of new forms of capital, financial sort of like capital financialization, where you see that a lot of this growth is sort of is not really creating jobs. It's very sort of like jobless growth. And at the same time, we've seen that there are a number of disparities in our region, because Africa is a country over 50-something countries. There are a number of disparities in terms of the policies and effect of this national policy, which sort of, because of growing sort of capital has become very nationalistic. For example, we've seen that like in South Africa, General Motors have just pulled out from the South African operation back to the USA, almost in line with the campaign by Donald Trump, where sort of like in a way we need to give first preference American when it comes to job creation. So we've seen that this sort of in a way has resulted in sort of like in a way in terms of the effect in terms of because we have got different capacities in terms of institutionally, and then at the same time in terms of political influence when it comes to the trade union movement. Then there's sort of like, in a way, a decline in as far when it comes to the traditional institutions of social dialogue. When you look at collective bargaining and institutions of collective bargaining becoming more and more irrelevant in as far as influencing macroeconomic performance, monetary stability, and employment creation is becoming almost irrelevant in as far as how that influence the economic, the national economic policies. So in a way, at the same time, because of these disparities, the sort of like, in a way, the disparities within nations and between nations, we've seen a growing increase in as far as intra and inter migration. And this has also seen a rise in this nationalism, which is very, in some cases, becomes xenophobia, which sort of like, in a way, with this sort of like a new neo-national capitalism. And it's also the competition when it comes to the lowest level, it is sort of like, you know, manifests itself as a form of xenophobia. And lastly, to conclude, sort of like, in a way, perhaps I would sort of in a way argue that maybe we have reached a point where capitalism has reached its limit in terms of maybe someone will talk about the capacity of capitalism to adapt itself. Maybe we have reached a point where it's sort of like it has reached its limit in terms of how possibility of it adapting. And maybe we should, maybe we're already in a new era in terms of an alternative sort of like economic model in as far as the capitalism as a system is concerned. Maybe we're already in a new alternative, and maybe we need to sort of, in a way, to reimagine and sort of like in terms of maybe how are we sort of where and how are we moving as a global economy in terms of maybe coming up with an alternative economic system.
Thank you, Crispen. After all the gloom and doom ending on this backhanded positive note. European perspective, please. Pinar.
Substitute.
Hello to everybody. My name is Bilge from Yenigun. I'm coming from Turkey. I'm working for the ILO office for Turkey. It's okay? No? Okay. Today, I will try to briefly summarize the current situation in Turkey and the impacts of neoliberal policies on the labor, especially. In early 80s, Turkey witnessed a military coup. So after the military coup, with the effects of unstable political situation, neoliberal policies have accelerated. And consequently, the privatization policies have adopted by the government. And with the privatization policies, the labor rights started to be restricted legally. And what are the impacts of the privatization policies? If we look at these are, the important impact is the precarity. What's the meaning of that? Longer working hours, worse and unsecure working conditions, limited workers' rights, and low wages. And if we look at the impacts of the neoliberal policies, we have to look at labor laws, because in Turkey, labor laws were changed after 80s. The important labor law violating the workers' rights is the Labor Law Act number 4857. It was adopted in 2003 with the new context of the Turkish labor flexibility. And with this labor law, the protection of the principle of protection of labor has started to be violated in Turkey. Another labor law violating the workers' rights is the newly enacted trade union and collective bargaining law. It was adopted in 2012, and it brought some thresholds for bargaining. It means that if a trade union wants to organize in a company, they have to reach 1% of the total number of workers at sectoral level. So, on the other hand, there is another threshold, and also the trade union has to exceed actually 50% of the workers, the number of workers at enterprise level for bargaining. It means that violation of the international labor standards and the other important point of the new trade union law is the authorization for bargaining is only given by the Ministry of Labor. So it means that this trade union law is very government-oriented, government-dominated law. On the other hand, in this law, strikes are prohibited in some sectors, especially in public sectors, such as banking and natural gas sectors. On the other hand, in practice, strikes can be banned by the government for reasons such as national security and public health. When we look at the unionization rate in Turkey, we see the picture actually, because the total number of workers is over than 13 million in Turkey, but the number of the unionized workers is only 12%, and this is the official number. In practice, in real life, it's considered that more than this number. And at this point, I would like to mention this situation, because as you all know, Turkey witnessed a bloody coup attempt on 15 July 2016, and after this coup attempt, the government, the Council of Ministers declared a state of emergency, which is called OHAL in Turkey. And following the coup attempt, unfortunately, we are now facing a regime without any constitutional limits. So during this period, the right to work is mostly violated under the state of emergency. Over 135,000 public employees have been dismissed without any concrete evidence by denying any means of defense and blocking channels of fair trial. Moreover, 9 trade unions affiliated with Jihansen and XII GLU Confederation were closed down for being in connection with the supporter of this coup attempt. And during this period, unfortunately, workers and unions faced various forms of oppression, violation, and threat, while many union activities and worker actions were banned and blocked. The right to strike is another violated issue. Actually, under the state of emergency, 5 large-scale strikes were banned for reasons such as national security, public health, and financial stability, only within 1 year of state of emergency. And to sum up, actually, as you all know well, Turkey is ruled by the AKP government, Justice and Development Party, for 15 years. So during this period, actually after the neoliberal policies and privatization of public services, the labor rights were restricted in Turkey, but after the AKP, these restrictions are getting, higher, and actually it means that the government considers rights for employers, not workers, in Turkey, and we see that the trade unions lost their powers compared to previous years, and the employment rate is getting higher, almost 20%. And we could say that AKP restricted the workers' rights, increased the working hours, and promoted the precarious and flexible work. Okay.
Thanks, Pinar. Mark, floor is yours. Professor Mark Anna from Penn State. North American perspective.
Hi everyone. I know we're getting close to the tea break, so I'll try to keep this quick and to the point. I'm not going to focus so much on Mexico and Canada because they're not behaving as badly, so this will be mostly about the United States. I'll start where I left off for those of you who are at the GLU summer school. I said then there were 3 possibilities for the U.S. election. That was the current situation was a year ago. We could have had a Democratic majority, and of course we ended up with the Republicans led by Trump controlling everything. The Senate, the House, the presidency, and now the Supreme Court. So the first question I'm going to look at is how do we get here? And then more importantly, for the theme for the day, what does it mean? What does it represent in terms of market authoritarianism? Is that what we have in the U.S.? So I decided I've done something a little different. I've added political cartoons because sometimes maybe it's either a choice of laughing or crying. Maybe we could laugh a little in the case of the U.S. So how do we get here? Well, there was Russian meddling. We know that. I think the evidence is getting more and more serious about that. Just one little footnote on this. There was a CIA director who was recently being interviewed about this in the CNN, and he said, well, we know they did it because they were caught on film celebrating afterwards. When we do it, we've never been caught on film celebrating afterwards. Right? So to put that in perspective, I started my political activism in Central America in the 80s. I mean, this is something the U.S. has done. So Russian meddling, I think we have the Clinton factor. I mean, she was a bad candidate. She campaigned poorly. She ignored a lot of the things Trump picked up on. She ignored rural areas. She thought she could win by having the majority of the votes in the cities. And there was also this FBI revelation, which was really, to emphasize, it was really troublesome the way it happened so close to the election. You are absolutely not supposed to reveal ongoing investigations 90 days before the election, and this was days before it. And I say this as a professor who deals with young people every day. My students, that I could tell, they were fired up about voting, and after the voting, then they were going to vote for Clinton. A lot of them were fired up about Sanders. They switched to Clinton, and they were just, literally, I could feel they were deflated. One of the big factors related to this was there was, in fact, less voter turnout in this election compared to Obama's prior election, and that was a strategy. It was not they're going to get Clinton supporters to switch to Trump, but they could at least disillusion them so much that they would stay home. And remember, the U.S. election are really 50 different elections. In my state, Pennsylvania, it went to Trump by 10,000 votes, and my university has 45,000 students. You could do the math on some of this, how close it was. This is a typo, or about race baiting, not batting. Race baiting, I mean, this is Trump's speech when he launched the campaign. When he launched the campaign is when he made this quote, right? So I'm gonna try to unpack that a bit, what this means. We talked about union power, union density. It's, you know, Turkey has a higher rate of unionization than the U.S. does now, at 12%. We're down around 11. But the important point too here is, and this is what the Republicans got, when you weaken unions, you weaken their political power, right? Their ability to influence elections. So the U.S. unions not only weakened in terms of their ability to represent workers, but in their ability to influence elections. But the point I want to really emphasize is just how bad inequality has gotten in the U.S. and how that was exploited by the Trump campaign. So here are some figures. If we break it down by race, we see stagnation. I'll look at inequality in a second. We don't see this, you know, displacement of the white working class by people of color. It's not in the evidence. If you look at the question of Mexican migration, this is people caught at the border. There's all different ways of measuring this. Migration from Mexico was down, has been in decline. You can see going back to basically about 2000. So this question about Mexican workers coming in and stealing U.S. jobs is being argued at a time when net migration is down. And then we have this chart of inequality, the top 1% in red, the bottom 50%. There was an eloquent argument that was becoming more and more powerful, which is the Occupy Wall Street, that this is the 99% against the 1%. That was growing. There was occupations that were taking place at universities, that were taking place at cities throughout the U.S., and the evidence is there to support it. So what's so bothersome and just that strategy of the Trump team to turn that argument around, to break down that narrative of the 99% against the 1%, which was supported by the evidence, and turn to the question of migrants from Mexico and so on. So try to understand now, getting to this question of market authoritarianism, you know, what are the influences on Trump? Just to try to break that down. You've got the traditional Republican Party. We know they were lukewarm. They went back and forth. Paul Ryan saying he wasn't sure if he could support Trump early on, ahead of the House of Representatives, Mitch McConnell from the Senate. Then you've got the Steve Bannon wing, and I would add to it Jeff Sessions. There was openly economic nationalism. Bannon had a very, very carefully thought out strategy and worldview on this. but the white nationalists were just a step away from the economic nationalists. And Sessions has a long history of being aggressively anti-immigrant, and we know now he's the Attorney General. There's Ivanka Trump, who's supposedly the one moderate in all this. She was once registered as a Democrat. I think her influence is non-existent now. And then we've got the finance people. These are representatives from Goldman Sachs who were in the administration, Mnuchin and Cohen. That segment fought a lot with the Bannon segment. We know Bannon is out. So if you ask this question, where is the economic nationalism or populism? It's there in discourse. Let me just put up some slides here. Buy American, American first. Build the wall, keep out. Against NAFTA, Mexico and Canada. There's this whole flurry around the carrier case. Firms will not leave the U.S. without facing consequences. And part of that nationalism, too, we know this speech he gave very recent at the United Nations, was basically saying nationalism for all. And I can't remember, at least a dozen times he mentioned sovereignty for all. But in the context of the bombing of Afghanistan, the biggest non-nuclear weapon ever used, talking about the possibility of having to invade Venezuela, talking about possibly eliminating North Korea from the map. So it's sovereignty for all unless you are Afghanistan, unless you are Venezuela, unless you are North Korea, and of course the attack on the Paris Peace Accord. Is this authoritarianism? What are the evidence for it? Well, we know he's done absolutely nuts with executive orders. There's been one after another, starting with his version of the Muslim ban. We know they changed the rules in Congress to have that Supreme Court judge elected, which tipped the balance in favor of the right wing. So it used to be a qualified majority, now it's a simple majority. They changed the rules there. We know he fired the director of the FBI when he was under investigation by the FBI. And here's a case, I don't know if people followed this, but there was a judge who was charged with racial profiling, Judge Arpaio. And Trump pardons him when the full case hadn't even gone through. And this is really, really important because it's assumed he was sending a message to folks who were being interrogated by the FBI around the Russia meddling case to say, don't be broken by them. Usually they build these cases by getting lesser level figures to speak out against their boss. But the message here was to say, hold out. Because if you are eventually charged, then the presidential pardon will come. So that pardon was really politically important in terms of Trump using his power there. Is it populist economic policy? A lot of people said this is not the case, and I agree. Here's a president who tried to eliminate health care for 22 million Americans. This is someone who's come out against the minimum wage increase. This is someone now who's overturning overtime rules that were favorable to millions of workers. This is someone who systematically attacks unions, and we're moving to cases now that are going to start to come up about taking union dues away from public sector unions. And this is someone who's now proposing a corporate tax cut from 35% to 20%. In terms of income tax, again, going back to the top 1% and so on, I don't know if you can read it there, but the current tax proposal would cut most dramatically taxes for the top 1%, almost 9%, and the top 0.1% get an almost 10% tax break, where the poorest 1/5 get 0.2% tax break. So here's another political cartoon about, we have a lot of controversy going on right now about American football players and kneeling during the national anthem. But this idea of he's got a match and he's burning Social Security, Obamacare, Medicare, Medicaid, and telling the voters to look at people protesting the flag. So are there any factors for moderation? I don't want to end on such a pessimistic note. We know that there was some pushback of the travel ban. We know that by one vote they failed to eliminate Obamacare. We know the FBI investigation is still going forward and growing. The future tax reforms are not clear to me. The next election could perhaps change the balance of power a bit. And I want to emphasize this. There is rising social protest. It's coming from quarters we didn't expect before. There was a Republican strategist who came on television soon after he won, and he said something that sort of really irked me, and it does to this day. He said, "We are going to hit you with shock and awe. We are going to pursue so many policies in concession, you're not going to know which one to protest when. As you just start protesting one, there's going to be another one, and there's going to be another one," right? It's a term you would use in terms of war and strategy, is what they were talking about with economic and social policies. And they've done that, and it's disoriented people. But now I think the smoke is starting to clear, and I think we're starting to see the emergence of more and more social protests. And there's fighting around wages against militarization and so on. Even on our small campus, big university, we have some protest movements there. I am fully aware that this Trump administration has cast a very dark shadow over the U.S. It's a dark chapter in our history, and it's casting a dark shadow across the world. But I hope, I feel that we're getting to the point where so many people are feeling just how adversely affected they are by this, that out of these ashes, there's some form of social movement that will emerge. I don't know how long it will take, but we can only hope that it has to happen, because this has to change. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We are running behind schedule by a few minutes, but I think it's only fair that if you have some clarificatory questions, remarks, responses, 5 to 10 minutes, please. So, a show of hands. Okay. Nicola.
Thanks. Sorry. Hi, I'm Nicola from South Africa. Thanks for the presentations. I just had a very quick question for Mark. You showed a very steady decline of the union rate in America, and it made me think of something an American comrade of mine told me, which scared me, and I'd like your view on this, which is that some people on the left in America are getting ready for the end of collective bargaining. The fact that gradually there would be almost no collective bargaining left in a few years' time if that trend continues and if the attacks continue. Well, I'd like your view on this, and I also wonder the extent to which it calls for a kind of regrouping in terms of resistance, even in the face of the shock and awe strategy. And aside from very rich, albeit black football players kneeling, do you see any other form of post-Occupy Wall Streets that could be showing the way for some kind of regrouping of the left for a response to that?
Okay. Yes, at the back, please, and then we'll come to you. Is there a microphone there, please? Saket, there, that on the left, second last row, please. If you can also introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Kevin Slayton. I'm a labor activist and researcher. Just a quick, two quick questions. One to Mark, and then to build on that. The question is, despite a lot of these aggressive policies and sort of the authoritarian bent of Trump, how much of a role does the U.S. political system, the federal system, and the ability of localities, municipalities especially, to sort of entrench themselves in certain progressive policies, how effective do you think that's been at pushing back the ability for cities to set a certain wage rate to protect some union rights and the sort? And then to build on that, the same theme across these different regions, I'd be interested to know if others feel that there is any aspect of this within countries or at a national level fighting back against regional or continental patterns, where some countries, because of their particular system, despite larger economic trends, are able to retrench themselves, or if it's because the dynamic is different, the U.S. is a different system, it's a much larger economy, there isn't really that nature or ability to protect certain sub-regions within a country or within a continental region.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, yes, there.
Hi, I'm Marcelo from Brazil. My question is for my compañero from Argentina, and after to Mark. First, don't you think that we should have more research on what is going on in Latin America, especially on local basis? I mean, there's a lot going on, especially general strikes, struggles, and all this pressure gives us a new breath, a new wind of change that we can sense, and then we would compare this to the previous moment that we have this divide between left, new 21st left, and the center left. So I think we should do more research on the what's going on, and then to bring these new things that are happening in Latin America now. And for Mark, I would like you to compare this rise of fascism, because I love the other professor. He didn't compromise with the word fascism. What's going on is fascism all over the world, and it's in the United States related to the South and KKK and stuff. But this gives us the opportunity to rearrange the labor movement, so the labor movement in the United States can open itself and be like an umbrella union for new movements and gather up, regroup, and then bringing what Christopher said, having small victories. But at the end, we should aim to the big ones. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcelo. Yes, please. And that will be the last. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Prabhat, and I'm a doctoral candidate at York University in geography. So my question is to the speaker from Argentina, from the American perspective. To follow up from what the previous speaker asked is, you talked about Gramsci and this optimism of the will and pessimism of the intellect, and what is it based on actually? Do you see any, ideologically counter-hegemonic forces emerging, maybe in terms of just ideology or organizational forms, even in its elementary forms? Do you see any hope emerging, which is something similar to what we saw a decade and a half ago in different countries of Latin America? Thank you.
Thank you. Pinar, do you want to say something? Because one question was addressed to all the panelists. Okay, Crispen, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, in terms of a new forms of resistance, we see in South Africa, particularly, we've seen new student movement, which in a way calling for a new order, not only in terms of maybe economic order, and at the same time aligning themselves to articulating their struggle to those of especially those workers that are generally left out by trade unions, workers who are in subcontracted and employed by external third parties. But at the same time, there's also a growing general rise in terms of protests within the broader society. But the problem is there's lack of connection between these movements. They're sort of in a way, they're disconnected. There's no connection between what is happening in the student movement and the protest in the broader society.
Thanks, Crispen. Louis?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, we must do more research on what is happening in Latin America and what has happened. I think that this 15 years of progressive governments, we should learn quite a lot from these political experiences, both in the political perspective and in the macroeconomical perspective. Because, for example, if we analyze the strikes, the general strikes, both in Brazil and Argentina, we have numbers, and we see that strikes in Argentina and Brazil jumped by more than 20 or 30% around 2011, 2012. So the wave or the wave of strikes, the labor conflict increased quite a lot during those progressive governments. So it's not a problem of the right-wing forces, but the problem is somewhere else. So we should research on that because many workers in Brazil went on strike during Lula and during Dilma government, and many workers in Argentina went to strike during the Kirchner's administration. So we should try to understand what that meant in that time, and what these strikes tell us about the recent past and the present. If there is some counter forces, well, let me be pessimistic. The intellectual, I think it's of course we always have the will, and there are some interesting things. For example, in Brazil, Lula is still the most important candidate for next year's presidential elections. So we hope there won't be any legal obstacle for him to be candidate. It's not that clear, and the right forces in Brazil are trying to ban Lula for next year elections. But the thing that Lula is in the first place in the polls for presidential elections for next year, well, it gives us some hope about the situation in Brazil. In Argentina, the situation is not that clear, but the crisis in Argentina is still in progress. We have not reached the end of the crisis, and we don't know exactly what people will do when things didn't work at the end of this crisis, which is in progress. So I think we should do more research, both for understand what's going on nowadays, but also to understand what happened in the past and how could we end it with this right-wing governments. And well, let me tell you that I'm not too optimistic for the existence of counter forces. We are kind of disoriented. Mark told us something similar related to the United States, but I think in South America we are also we are feeling some disorientation. And I would like all to say again that the situation in Venezuela is quite difficult. We should be very worried about the situation in Venezuela because we don't have armed conflicts in the region, and well, Venezuela is there, so we should be very cautious about the situation in Venezuela.
Thank you, Louis. Mark, you have almost the last word, not quite.
Thanks everyone for these questions and comments. Nicolas, yeah, collective bargaining is a huge problem. It's tightly linked to the unionization rate. Private sector unionization rate is about 6.6%, and these are very correlated because you don't get extension of collective bargaining beyond this workplaces that are unionized. So that's about the collective bargaining crisis coverage. So that's there. It's in crisis and it's in decline. And if you can't organize workers and if you can't change their conditions, then it's a very serious situation. Regarding sort of mobilizations and fighting back and so on, and I know certain things get more attention than others. I try to emphasize a range of protests. Right now it's on television, a lot of the football players, but there's a lot of mobilization. After Charlottesville, there was an organization of white supremacists going to Boston. When that demonstration took place, at the end of the day, there were 100 white supremacists and about 20,000 counter-demonstrators there. There is a mobilization happening. There is a pushback.
happening. We don't know how long it's going to take to articulate itself. The people that participated in Occupy Wall Street are still there. A lot of them were the ones that would have been mobilized in some of these recent rounds of anti-racist protests. And keep in mind, too, with that election, we talked about Clinton, yet Bernie Sanders in the primary election got 13 million votes, right? A candidate for the US context to openly say he was a socialist, right? So those people are there too. So somehow, I think there will be a much more articulated opposition movement. I just don't know how long it's going to take. I share the feeling right now there's some disorientation, and that was planned. Like I said, the strategy was shock and awe, and people are still recovering from that. But you know, one of the things you could say too, and I'll go back to the football players, Trump talked a lot about the Muslim ban, and that mobilized a group of people. Then he started talking about the Mexicans, that mobilized another group. Then when it got to Charlottesville, and he started talking about, well, there were some good people in the white supremacist march, and they were chanting blood and soil, and they were chanting Jews will not displace us. This is not xenophobia. Now you've moved to the core of the African American community, and those groups are really starting to mobilize because they get it, right? They get it, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. So I'll end it. Thanks.
Thanks. So all of us will agree that this has been an extremely insightful panel, connecting extremely well with a fantastic keynote that we had, complementing and expanding on some of the issues which was raised in the keynote. And our panelists deserve a very good round of applause. With that, let's break for tea. We come back in about 15 minutes. Thank you.